Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video we're going to talk about backup sight radius on rifles. Well, first of all, the topic's right there in the name. Backup sights. Backup sights on a rifle. What do we have backup sights for? If our optic fails. So they're a secondary or even a tertiary sighting system depending on what your rifle's set up for. There's been a common belief among some people that if you have a rail and you have a lot of rail space, you should push that front sight all the way out to the front of the rail, and it should take priority over all other accessories. And that opinion is, depending on what your rifle's set up for, pretty much wrong. Proper context here is a rifle that's used for self-defense purposes. Law enforcement, military, self-defense for the citizen. This isn't talking about competition shooting for irons or something like that, because those rifles have a different purpose, and the iron sights may be the only method of aiming on the rifle. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a rifle that's for a duty or a personal defense use, and I think that's important to put into context for the purposes of this video. This is one of the reasons the topic came up. I decided to do a video specifically on it. This is the Core V rail for the Cloud Defensive OWL. They made a specific rail to allow the the weapon light to sit lower in the rail space. Gives you a more even grip when you come over the top to activate the light, so you don't have to put your thumb as high, but that's kind of beside the point, because the video is about the sight radius. As you can see, my front sight is behind my light controls. This is not uncommon. Depending on rail space, that light's going to take priority regardless. So light gets priority placement because this gun's primary purpose is day and night use. It's not a night vision gun or anything like that. Without the light, I can't use the optic. I can't use the sights. So if I were to put my front sight in front of the light for whatever reason, on this rail it's not really designed for that, that might give me a greater sight radius, but if it somehow places the light activation source just slightly out of reach or in a place where it just doesn't make sense ergonomically speaking, then I've kind of defeated myself. On this rail, the front sight is behind the light activation source, and like I said, without the light, if I'm using this gun, we're going under the assumption that I'm using the gun for a low light, and let's say my optic stops working for whatever reason, I can't use these iron sights as their backup purpose without activating that light. So that light's going to take priority of placement. It's going to be in a place where it ergonomically makes sense for my thumb to activate it versus having it back here, which would change my grip, bring my arm in a little bit too far, and create instability on the gun. It's not something I want. Now this is not a whole lot of sight radius, and some people say, well, you got to have more sight radius to be accurate. In fact, get my little tape measure out here, and we're looking at just over 11 inches of sight radius for a 223/5.56 rifle. Is 11 inches of sight radius enough to be able to shoot to reasonable self-defense distances? The answer is, well, yeah, it is. If you can shoot a 5-inch sight radius handgun at 25 yards, common sense dictates that 11 inches on a rifle is going to give you the same or more performance, more accuracy, so to speak. But there's that camp of individuals that wants to be able to shoot everything at 300 meters, and they always use this ridiculous, or not necessarily ridiculous, but less likely measurement metric to defend some of the things that they say. So they say, well, you can't hit steel at 300 meters with it. Yeah, I can. I took the optic off, flipped the iron sights up, and I shot that steel plate, which was not a full body size steel plate, by the way, as you saw. It's kind of similar to the old E-type 50-meter silhouette, which is head and shoulders. So I was shooting at head and shoulders at 300. I don't really know what more you'd want from backup iron sights. Now keep in mind, they're backup sights. I know I've said that a few times. And I guess my point being is I can't remember the last time I had an optic fail and I had to use my backup sights. Doesn't mean it can't happen. Doesn't mean it can't happen. But for reasonable, more realistic distances, I think I've got other options available to me, such as a secondary weapon, handgun or whatever, if it's really close, or just, not engaged, depending on, what your reason for shooting is. If I'm at the range and my optic fails, I don't even have to use my backup sights. I can just go home. Of course, I probably wouldn't. I would actually get in some practice reps with my backup sights, because why not get the opportunity to train on a sighting system that exists on your gun and you put it on there for a reason. But in my experience, and I see this in rifle classes, is people put backup sights on their gun and they zero them, and then they hardly ever use them. And when I have students flip up those backup sights and shoot them, sometimes they're not zeroed. And that's on the student. Something has happened, it's got knocked around in the safe, or a little knob got turned or whatever, or they've taking them off and putting them back on, moving them from gun to gun, whatever the reason is. But what I found is the backup sights, they still serve a very valid purpose, but some other things are going to take priority based on what the rifle is for. So if I'm able to hit head and shoulders at 300 meters with 11 inches of sight radius, what is the optimal sight radius? And there's a lot of great information out there on what optimal sight radius is. You can have too much sight radius. You take an M16A4 and compare it to your more common lengths that you see today, such as the M4A1 or Mark 18 or some of the even shorter guns than that. They're able to perform to the same distances as far as accuracy goes off of the iron sights. Some people would argue that you can't get as much precision on the longer sight radiuses because the peep sight is too far away from the front sight post to create, it actually creates kind of a foveal vision issue for some shooters, especially those people with older eyes. So it's one of those arguments that's going to be cyclical. We're going to keep having it, but I wanted to make this video specifically to talk about it because if I can hit 300 meters on 11-inch sight radius, then no, my sight radius isn't too short. 11 inches of sight radius getting me out to 300 meters. Yeah, I'm sure the group's not that great, but again, it's 11 inches of backup sight radius. If the optic has failed, stopped working for whatever reason, I've got backup sights on this gun. Would I make the sight radius any shorter than this? No, I don't have to. This is as far forward as I can get it while still maintaining light control. And again, this is a very purpose-built rail. On other guns that I have where I've got, you know, this is a 9.5 inch rail. If I've got 11 inches of rail space, 10 inches of rail space, I may be able to get that front sight in front of the light body or in front of the pressure pad or in front of the laser device, which is something I wouldn't do, but I've talked about that in videos before. If I've got a 14-inch rail or a 15-inch rail, the sight's going to go where it's going to go. I've had guns before that I was running a side-mounted a 3 o'clock or a 9 o'clock light source, and I only had an iron sight up top. The optic was obviously back on the receiver, and the front sight was 3 or 4 inches back because I found that to be the optimal place for the sight radius that I wanted. That 20-inch M16 sight radius just doesn't do it for me, especially with that really fat front sight post. I like to have it a little further back so I get a little bit more clarity in my focal plane relationship between the rear and the front sight. Of course, don't take my word for it. If you've got two guns, two different rail lengths, try it out. If you find that your front sight is stick hanging out there in the Of course, don't take my word for it. This is something you should definitely check out on your own. If you can borrow a buddy's gun or when you go to a range and see different sight radiuses and see if you're able to get those hits. If you have the ability and the ammunition and the time to conduct an experiment, go ahead and move that front sight back, especially if that front sight is kind of cumbersome and in the way of where you'd rather put another device. It's not necessarily wise to do things a certain way just because someone tells you to. And I'm not advocating that you move your front sight for no reason whatsoever. What I'm saying is if something else needs to take priority, such as a light activation pad on a weapon light, maybe that front sight can take second place to placement based on needs. That's just something that kind of makes sense to me, and that's something that I'm going to continue to do. So if I have to have an 11-inch, for an example, sight radius, I'm going to do it because I can still get the work done. And of course, if the optic never goes down, or if the optic doesn't go down when I'm using it, because all optics are going to go down at some point when the battery dies, not a problem. And if I do proper maintenance on an optic and I do, I buy quality optics, then the chances of my optic going down are definitely lessened. And of course, someone in the comments section is going to bring up the EMP, because that's happened a lot. And my advice to you is actually research what an EMP does and how close you have to be to a nuclear explosion in order for the EMP to affect your optics, and what would likely happen to you before the EMP killed your optic. And of course, you know, someone else will bring up the argument that if the EMP is in the atmosphere, it's going to be totally different. And again, that's happened so many times, I can't count how many times my optics have been knocked out by atmospheric stratosphere burst EMPs. It's just such a plague on modern electronics. Yeah, it can happen. Probably get struck by lightning first. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.